The other thing about being ancient here is, of course, it is probably the first book of the Bible ever to be penned. The first. Job's an ancient man from a very ancient manuscript. First book of the Bible. What does this mean? What we just read was written before Genesis was written. These words were penned in human history before Genesis 3:15 was put down on paper. Before. This is ancient. If this is true, not before Genesis 3:15 was spoken, right? But before it was written. Moses wrote that when they came out of Egypt. That was a long time after this. Okay? How does this work? Okay? So for instance, think about Abraham. Abraham, he, as Christ says, he knows that Christ is coming. Abraham saw my day and rejoiced, right? That's what Jesus said. Have you ever asked yourself the question, how did Abraham know about Jesus? You might think, well, obviously he read Genesis. But then you remember, he didn't have Genesis. Abraham didn't have any scripture. How did he know about Jesus? Of course, Abraham's a prophet. He has revelation from God. That's true. But is there any backbone structure to the ancient world before Moses wrote that tells people that the Christ is coming? Of course, the promise of Genesis 3:15 is echoing through the ages before Moses puts pen to paper. Now, if you think Adam and Eve didn't leave that paradise garden clinging to what God had just said, He's going to send somebody, there's going to be a seed, a child who's going to undo what just happened. If you don't think that was their treasure, you haven't entered the narrative. If you don't think that they taught their children diligently, God, this is how this happened, but God promised that He would send somebody. You see this even in the genealogies, right? Noah is eventually born from Seth's line, and his dad prophesies over him and says, he's going to give us rest. And in that prophecy is maybe a guess, perhaps Noah is the seed that was promised. When the promise comes to Abraham, then, you're going to have a son who's going to bless the whole world. Of course, he has the backdrop of the original promise of Genesis 3:15. So if this is the oldest written book in Scripture, what this means is Job is God's first expansion on the Protoevangelium. He promises the gospel in Genesis 3:15. The next special revelation event that happens in history is Job. He's first up. First to bat. What does this mean? Well, just like on a music album, often what you want to do when you release an album is put a very energetic song up front. You want to put a really good one up front that draws in the listener, and then maybe after that it tones back and works its way again. Job is like that. It's brilliant, it's loud, it's explosive, it's bright, and it's the first song in the album of Scripture. You might think of a classical piece, a symphony. Sometimes when a symphonic song begins, they almost reach the crescendo, but not quite. They draw back, the song cools down, and it comes later. But what the composer is doing is right away, they're letting the listener know this is where we're going. Job is like that. It rises to the heights of what God was going to do with a son of man to overthrow the devil.